Nigerian opposition candidate Atiku Abubakar is challenging the recent election results there. Incumbent President Muhammadu Buhari beat Abubakar by nearly 4 million votes. But Abubakar says the results are a sham. He claims voting was suppressed in areas where the opposition had strong support. Voter turnout was one of the lowest in the country that they've seen in 2 decades. A recent study by Afrobarometer shows that the quality of democracy in Africa as a whole is worrying. We're now joined by Tapiwa Chadia from the African Exponent to speak more about this. Tapiwa, very good afternoon to you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me.
Nigerians have voted. The Senegalese have voted. They aren't the only countries set to go to the polls. We are also voting in May.
Yes.
A lot of hunger clearly on the continent for democracy. But why are we so seemingly so bad at that form of government?
Well, I believe democracy is a borrowed derivative into Africa. As if Africans, we have our own ways and systems that we were using before. So when we were colonized, after we then get independence, there's been issues of having the African Renaissance, of course, coming from Ghana, from one of the African icons, Kwame Nkrumah. He wanted to have one African Union, and Africa for everyone. But the issue now was that Africa is so deeply divided that they could not come up with one unity of purpose, to be together and to have one unity of purpose. So as a result, we've got different multiple countries in Africa, which then are trying to implement the system of democracy. But because of how the leaders, those who are put in power, because of how they then become corrupt, we have seen that democracy is failing in Africa.
You speak about how democracy was a colonial thing imposed on Africans, if I can phrase it that way for you.
Yes.
What then is the alternative between democracy and complete authoritarian rule?
Well, we are living in a new political, social, and economic dispensation where the issues, the principles, for instance, of kinghood, monarchs, is now being phased out. So Africa then needs to speeden up its processes, to have the proper infrastructures so that democracy, well, let's say we're speaking of elections, there are some parts of Africa where when it comes to elections, people don't have to fill in the ballot papers. I mean, they just have to stand in the line and people go this side, or they just go behind their leader. At this day and age, that should not happen. It's a travesty of democracy. We are supposed to be using technology these days, using what you go, using your fingerprints for voting. But if we are still using ballot papers, it means we are still behind. So there's a need to grow the infrastructure in Africa for us to be able to have peaceful elections in Africa.
But Tapia, the issue in Africa is not necessarily the machinery that is used for the electoral process, at least.
Definitely.
At the heart of it is a political elite in various parts of the continent that has issues with either giving up power,
correct,
or an elite that is obsessed with obtaining power at any means. How do we deal with that?
Well, it's close to impossible to deal with that, because the issue now is that the political elites, because there is no ombudsman or any opposition party which is in any country, they don't have enough machinery or enough systems, independent systems, to challenge the government and to put those who are in power to accountability. As a result, those who are in positions, they loot, they kill, they do whatever it is to retain power. Look at a person like from the DRC. We had presidents from the DRC. We had Kabila in the DRC. We had Mobutu Sese Seko in the DRC. They were rich just for themselves. In Nigeria, we had also Sani Abacha. He had about 4 billion, that amount of money that he externalized just for himself. The same thing is happening in Zimbabwe. You've got the president who is there now, Emmerson Mnangagwa. He travels around the world begging for money. But on a daily basis, a leader is using a plane which costs $5 million per day. And those leaders are just selfish, and they cater for themselves and their small communities.
You speak about a body and regulation. Often when we do have an election on the continent and things go belly up, you hear these calls for intervention from the African Union, from SADC, but their intervention itself has been problematic, isn't it? Because a lot of the citizens on the continent don't trust the AU and SADC. So can we continue to rely on them as continental bodies that can be entrusted with ensuring a fair system of governance on the continent, a system that reflects or respects human rights over and above the interests of those in power?
So the only regional body that I do give respect, of course, because of the footprint of the work that they have done, is ECOWAS. ECOWAS has done a lot in terms of democracy, governance, and human rights. They've stood up, they've been united in the way they've dealt with things. Look, if you look at SADC on its own, SADC has got no voice. There's no voice in SADC. No one champions the issues of people. If Zimbabwe is burning, it means that there's going to be a ripple effect in SADC. South Africa is going to suffer. Mozambique is going to suffer. DRC is going to suffer. But no one speaks up. They just sit together and have tree. That's the only things that they do. If we look at the African Union, oh well, they do absolutely nothing.
Why won't leaders on the continent call each other out? What is the difficulty?
I believe because there is so much divisions within Africa. If we do not have an African Union, a united Africa that represents the Africans, remember the main and the sole cause and the main reason why we had the African Union, the OAU in the beginning, 1963, from Kwame Nkrumah, was to say we need to assist each and every single African country to be independent from the colonialists. And that happened. We saw that happening in Zimbabwe. We saw that happening in South Africa, where the leaders came together for one unity of purpose, but those who are there now are not doing anything to uplift that Pan-African system of African Renaissance.
There isn't a shortage of problems, clearly, on the continent. You look, this morning we woke up to scenes coming out of Algeria where citizens have taken to the streets. They're saying to President Abdelaziz Bouteflika that you cannot run for another term in office. He is terribly ill, so sick that in 2017 he had to be helped to cast his ballot in the election. Omar al-Bashir is facing problems of his own. He's had now to declare some sort of state of emergency that would prevent the Sudanese from going to the streets against his rule. Yet the al-Bashir issue, for instance, wasn't a new one because he was allowed to come to South Africa for that AU summit without any sort of consequences. When you look at those issues with some of the other problems that we're facing as a continent, do you believe these solutions lie in the democratic system of government, or are we going to see something similar to what we saw in 2011 with the Arab Spring, where a system has to collapse in its entirety before there's any sort of rebuilding and reconfiguration of the running of the continent?
So there are two systems of Africa. Africa has got two streams. We've got sub-Saharan Africa, and then on the Arab side of Africa where we've got Algeria and so forth. They, on their own, they've got a way where you have the citizens affecting the system or affecting whatever it is that they have the power, because they understand that when a leader is there, it's because of them as people. So as a result, we have seen them that they're able to rise. We saw in the Arab Uprising, it started in one country and it spread like a house on fire into the other countries. And as a result, there was a change of leaders. Those who had been in power for a very long time, they were removed. But there's a difference now when it comes to the sub-Saharan Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, the way we look at elections, for instance, you know, we were speaking about this. When we speak of elections, there are some people from some parts of Africa who cannot pronounce. Instead of putting L, they put an R. So they speak of erections instead of elections. And it goes on to say that they actually erect certain people into positions, and those people are never competent. We have sun in Africa. But to this day and age, we're not using converting that sun into electricity. We don't have solar power in Africa. We are still struggling in terms of education. Access into other parts of the world, of the continent, are difficult and impossible. There's no network, there's no coverage. And that tells you that those who are in power, even though Africa is rich in terms of minerals, in terms of resources, we're not converting that into derivatives or into anything that is going to benefit the community.
Speak to me about the complicity of African citizens in their own suffering. Because when you speak about the various authoritarian regimes, dictators aren't born overnight.
Definitely.
Usually they come in through a coup, win a first election, win a second, and by the time you get to the third, you're dealing with a leader who simply refuses to go. Yet, whenever elections, be they valid or a sham, are called, these leaders do still have some support in their country.
So a very good example is when we look at in Zimbabwe, in the SADC region, we had President Robert Mugabe, and currently the one who followed after him, Emmerson Mnangagwa. They were very brutal in the way that they were dealing with citizens. In the beginning, everyone was behind them. After people got freedom, after people got independence, but independence came without freedom, and that is futile when you have got freedom without, when you've got independence without freedom. So they started manipulating the systems. They started beginning to become corrupt. Whatever was there in the country, they began to take and accumulate resources for themselves, and having Swiss bank accounts where they were externalizing foreign currency, externalizing the money from the country. And because they get so corrupt, because they accumulate a lot of money, it becomes close to impossible for them to relinquish their positions. And they then start instituting and instigating violence whenever there's elections, because they're going to lose power. They then unleash the dragon into the people. They started beating people up. And because there's no big brother, there's no one who's going to come and play the supervisory role or to clip their wings. If you look at the United Nations, the only way the United Nations would go and intervene, or US would go and intervene into a country, is because of what they gain as a result. If there's oil, if there's diamonds, if there's gold, they'll quickly go and intervene. We saw what they did in Afghanistan and Iraq.
And just on that, how much of the troubles in Africa are engineered by the West for its interests, its benefit? Because just in talking about Senegal this time last week, people were saying that much of the problems with the economic boom there are that the French, a former colonial power, still has a lot of sway in what happens in the country currently.
So in all the Francophone countries, they still pay their tithes, they still pay their taxes into France, which is not right. At this day and age, we have seen that the states, mostly the Francophone countries, they still have got a very direct rule which comes from France, and which is not right. It means that they are not independent in themselves. And the reason why the former colonizers are still in touch with the African politics, the day-to-day runnings, the reason why they still have got a say is because they've been allowed to do that. It's because as Africans, even though we've got resources, we've allowed ourselves to be manipulated through multinational corporations and through foreign direct investment, and we have become now independent. And we assume that we don't have resources, yet we have enough resources. We have the manpower, we have the minerals, we've got cocoa in Ghana, we've got diamonds and all the minerals, but what we do is that we export those raw products, and when they come back at a higher price. And the solutions for Africans, I believe they lie inside the people of Africa. At some stage, the Africans have to rise up and take whatever belongs to them.
So back to an era of African solutions for African problems.
Definitely.
Tapiwa, thank you so much for your time. That was Tapiwa Chadia from the African Exponent, speaking to us about the state of democracy on the African continent and just casting ahead to the elections that have either been held or are going to be held in various parts of the continent over the course of this year. And that is it from me for today. Checkpoint is up next, and then Marcel Gordon will have all your latest news on ENCA lunchtime at 1 o'clock.